Hey everyone, what's going on? It's Rob No Crook here, founder of the Digital Nomads Forum, and in just a moment here, we're going live with a question and answer session on taxes for digital nomads, and we're gonna have Derren Joseph, who's a international tax expert for remote workers and digital nomads, joining. So if you guys have questions about your tax stuff, then now's the chance to get an expert's opinion on it at no cost here in the Digital Nomads Forum. So just bear with me for a moment here while I get the tech set up and get Darren invited. Okay. Hey Hassan, what's going on? We're just kicking off here in a minute with tax talk for digital nomads and remote workers. Just waiting to get Derren Joseph, our international tax expert for digital nomads, on the stream. And we're just, sorting out the Facebook Live stuff. So he's joining right now, and we're going to get going in just a moment. Okay. Hey Hassan, so I see your question there about how many countries are offering digital nomad visas. That's a great question. Go ahead and post that actually in the Digital Nomads Forum, and myself or another community member will definitely answer that for you. But today we're talking specifically about taxes, not specifically visas. So we'll get a chance to answer your question there. And here we go. I think Darren. Okay. All right, there we go. Darren, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear as well. Just adjusting the volume. Now your head though looks like it's zoomed in. I can only see your nose down here. Okay, that's a little bit better. All right.
All right.
So Darren, okay, we're talking about taxes for digital nomads and remote workers today. But before we jump into it, where are you in the world right now?
I'm in Lisbon, Portugal.
All right, a true digital nomad even during COVID. And I remember, I don't even know, 6 months, a year ago when we did our last chat here in the Digital Nomads Forum, you were, I think, somewhere in Southeast Asia then. Do you remember?
Yeah, I was in Singapore. I've been based in Singapore for the
Okay.
past 7 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've been bouncing around. I love it. Okay.
Hmm.
And for people who are not familiar with yourself, I just briefly introduced you as an expert for kind of international digital nomad taxes. Tell us a little bit more about your background, though, and why, everyone knows what taxes. Maybe we shouldn't be asking in Facebook groups how to do it, but why are you qualified to give a little bit of better advice than the average Facebook group member?
Sure, that's a great question. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to exchange ideas with yourself and your group once again. It's a pleasure and an honor to be back. You feel free to reach out to me on Facebook, those who are watching, or on LinkedIn. Essentially, I've done finance all my adult life. My license, my active tax license is with the US. So I'm what is called an IRS enrolled agent. So I'm one of those people who is licensed to practice before the Internal Revenue Service. But I've also studied taxes in the UK as well. I have a UK qualification. And by practice, I'm pretty much familiar with Southeast Asia since I've been based there for the past 7 years. I run a small team, semi-autonomous team within a larger practice called Moore's Rule in Asia Pacific. So that office, we have about 30 offices in 12 countries. So as far north as Beijing and Tokyo, all the way down to Australia and New Zealand. So, but I've been sitting in Singapore for the past 7 years. But like most of you guys here, I move around a lot. Not as much as before COVID-19, but I still move around a bit.
That's awesome. Okay. Well, welcome. Thanks for coming. So anyone who's tuned in, if you do have any questions you want us to kind of jump into on taxes for remote workers and digital nomads, drop them in the comments and we'll get into it. But for a lot of people, they're probably going to be watching the recording as well. And so maybe what we could start off with, what are some of the, and I know we've talked about before, but we're going to have a whole new group of people right now. So what are some of the biggest myths that you're seeing that kind of this group of digital nomads think is true when it comes to taxes as they begin to kind of travel the world and work remotely as digital nomads?
Well, I tend to categorize people into three boxes, right? There'll be those who are US exposed. So these with US passports and green cards. There are those that belong to what I would call they basically the wealthy countries. So like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, and Europe, and probably Japan as well. And then there's the rest of the world. And each of these boxes, or these three boxes, have their different complexities. Of course, the most complex tends to be US persons because it's nearly impossible to break tax residency. So regardless of how many years you spend outside of the US, you are required to file and pay taxes. And it's counterintuitive in that the IRS pays more attention to reporting than it does to paying taxes. So you don't pay your taxes. It's a already low interest rate. You pay interest, you pay some penalty, but you don't report that you have a foreign company, or you don't report that you have foreign bank accounts or financial accounts, which includes investment accounts. That could result in criminal penalties pretty quickly. So US is pretty much on reporting. In terms of the other wealthy countries, I guess the key thing to remember is that a lot of them, and I'm painting with a really broad brush, and I know that is something not advisable, but just for the purposes of this conversation, if it is that you leave your country of origin, you must establish residence somewhere else. Otherwise, many of these countries have a fallback position. They're saying, if you can't prove to me that you're tax resident somewhere else, then even though you've not been in Australia for years, you've been traveling all over the world, the ATO's position is, hey, come and pay tax back here. Same with the CRA in Canada and other European countries as well. So you need to be resident somewhere. In terms of the rest of the world, again, it's easier for them to lull into this false sense of security that they can just continue forever without paying taxes anywhere. I think just generally speaking, countries are becoming more aggressive when it comes to taxation for a number of reasons. And if it is that you are a perpetual nomad and you don't have a passport from one of those countries with fallback positions, while legally it's possible that you are not tax resident anywhere, at some point in time it may come back to haunt you, because then you have banking complications, because you're not only thinking about taxation, you're also thinking about banking rules, which are also becoming super strict.
Yeah.
So you may have money, but you may be locked out of certain banking systems. So I think that's a sort of general,
All right.
introduction.
So maybe to recap it, if you're starting to work outside of your home country, basically it probably doesn't mean you're exempt from paying some tax, or at least needing to check in with the kind of tax authorities or an accountant from your country to see, what are my implications? Because it might feel like, hey, okay, so I'm Canadian, I go to Thailand, I'm doing all my work in Thailand, why do I have to pay taxes in Canada? But actually, you probably have to, unless for some reason you're exempt, right? So basically, check in with an accountant or an international tax pro of some sort to make sure you're just doing things the way they should be. Okay, awesome. And I know since we last chatted as well that you had started to interview quite a few different people in all kinds of disciplines, especially in the world of remote work, to kind of get their take on COVID-19 and kind of, I think, how maybe that relates a bit to the world of digital nomadism and taxes and earning remotely and all these things. How many people did you end up interviewing in total since you started that?
We've probably spoken to over 100 people.
Wow.
And some of them are on our podcast, but a lot of them are not. But it was an educational piece, not just in terms of, like social media engagement, but also, just as I told you when you graciously agreed to be interviewed, my motives are slightly selfish in that I'm trying to understand myself, what is going on, and what are the implications that I need to take into consideration for myself and my team, as well as what should I be thinking when I'm speaking to my clients. So it was kind of like putting my finger on the pulse of what's happening.
All right, and I remember asking, well, I'm going to be curious then to find out what you found out. So now, with 100+ people, like, that's pretty interesting. There's not, because honestly, there's not that many people kind of, I think, taking the pulse, as you described, with such a broad group of different people all over the world with such a issue that is truly global. So I'm actually quite genuinely curious now to learn, and can you share just maybe what were some of the biggest takeaways you've kind of learned through these interviews?
So I think the number one takeaway, if I just to summarize it pretty quickly, is that this health crisis hasn't necessarily created anything new. It has accelerated pre-existing trends. Now, and quite a number of pre-existing trends, and you could pick on what is relevant or important to you, which will be different from someone else. But in terms of taxation, governments were pretty aggressive previously, are becoming increasingly aggressive in exchanging information. We have FATCA, we have CRS, we have the automatic exchange of information, and making sure that it's not necessarily a revenue collection piece, but it's intelligence gathering. They want to know what people are doing across the world, and that's going to increase. We're moving towards a more of a cashless society, and there are cities and there are jurisdictions already where contactless seems to be the default. So therefore, you're using the banking system. Therefore, you're part of the mainstream currency system. So it's not so much cash. You're not off the grid anymore. Everything needs to connect. So there's the tax piece, which is more an information thing rather than revenue. There is the movement of people. When you look at how people travel over the past 150 years or so, there was a time you can travel to the US. If you went across the Atlantic, you came up maybe at Ellis Island, and you have no ID. You just tell them what your name was. They do a quick health check and welcome to New York, right? Then they decided,
That's so crazy to think about, eh?
Then they decided, hey, you need some sort of ID. Then they decided you need a passport. Then you decided you need a visa. So the impediments to the free movement of people have been increasing, and I think the whole system of visas has, to a large extent, been thrown out. And we're seeing travel
Okay.
bubbles, travel corridors, green lanes, and those will be here to stay. That and
What kind? Sorry, what lanes did you say there?
green lanes. So, for example, the
Green
green
lanes.
lane
Okay.
between Singapore and Hong Kong, or Australia, New
Oh,
Zealand, which is
okay. Now, what is that? I'm
public
not
facing.
familiar with that term. Tell us a bit more.
Sure. So that's where, remember, no more visas, right? So these are, well, at least the default where you have, for example, a visa, or if you were Australian or New Zealander, you have visa-free entry to Europe or to the US. So right now, to a large extent, Europe is saying, well, no non-essential travel coming in unless you are a resident of the EU or certain jurisdictions or whatever. So a green lane or a travel corridor, a travel bubble is where two countries have assessed each other and they decided, you know what, we are at like the same stage in dealing with the virus. And as a result, I'm going
Oh,
to let
okay.
your guys come in without necessarily doing like 14 days quarantine or whatever. And you let my
Yeah.
people go in without letting going to quarantine. So I
Okay.
think like Australia, New Zealand was the first one. Singapore and Hong Kong announced it, but then they backpedaled when Hong Kong had a spike. And within the EU, when it first happened, of course, borders were shut, but then eventually the flow of people was allowed again. So yeah, so that trend is going to continue, I believe, which means that short-term travel is probably impeded. And which is to the point, I saw the first, like one of the first questions asked and you responded to. The default is probably going to be longer term trips because by the time you go to quarantine somewhere, you're already 2 weeks in.
Yeah.
So you're going to be there for a while. And then countries are not allowing, so let's say Bali, lots of people were in Bali. So there may not be a digital nomad visa for Bali, but there's a social visa and there's a business visa, both of which are long-term
Yeah.
visas. So
Yeah.
that sort of thing, or what Barbados, Bermuda, or whoever is doing, that's going to be perhaps part of the new normal. So yeah,
Okay.
those are some of the things that we're seeing. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So two things I thought were kind
Yeah.
of especially interesting in there. The
Mm-hmm.
first was it sounds like okay, we historically countries like the US started where you could just show up and get in and now, you need a visa and I think you're right on it, not just on a US basis, but on a global scale, all of the countries seem to be really kind of progressing towards more I guess tight rules about who can come in and making sure they know who's coming in and having that all tracked and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, though, what I think I'm realizing right now is that there's a very unfair kind of situation happening because as a Canadian with many other nationalities in this Digital Nomads Forum group that I've run, I've noticed that it seems, and maybe you can confirm my suspicion here, that stronger economic countries have technically stronger passports in the sense that they have much less loopholes to jump through to visit the majority of other countries around the world, whereas countries with basically poorer economic conditions, their passport is not as strong and they face much more scrutiny for entering other countries. Is this roughly accurate on a global scale, would you say?
I think I would agree with you. Again, that was one of those pre-existing trends where you have, well, I guess, greater social inequality
Yeah,
was a thing.
exactly.
I think we saw in the early post-World War period, like a growing middle class, and so the gap between the wealthy and the poor was kind of shrinking, at least in the Western
Okay.
world, Western Europe, North America, and other parts of the developing world as well, including Asia. And then from like the late 70s into the 80s, we saw a reversal of that. And that has
Okay.
indeed accelerated the gap between the rich and the poor. And that's happening within countries and between countries as well. So the gap
Okay.
between a wealthy country and a poor country is growing, and the privileges that come with it. But having said that, remember within the country as well. So, for example, historically, a US passport was a pretty strong passport. Now, the list of countries that would let a U.S. passport holder in.
Right? It's funny. Well,
Yeah,
it's not funny, but it's
yeah,
interesting.
it is interesting. So, but so that list is probably on the shorter side right now. But the way around that is there are application processes, like we spoke about Indonesia, and of course these things come at a price. So I think that's where the wealth
Yes,
comes in. So if you have the money, you could probably still get into most countries in the world right now, to be honest with you. You
yeah,
just need to,
and
you pay your attorneys, they go through whatever process. Every country that I'm aware of, they have some exception to the rule that's in play right now because they still need
especially
business.
for kind of business related activities, right?
Exactly, your business
Yeah.
executives, you still want your investors in. The Philippines has allowing investors in before they allowed spouses and kids of Filipino citizens. They allowed investors, so that shows the priority.
Jeez, that's terrible.
Yeah, yeah, but so my point is, I agree with you. It is,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
So what this kind of means then, I think,
Mm-hmm,
at least in the short term, and I'm going to talk about the long term with you in a minute,
mm-hmm,
is that actually the barrier to entry for digital nomadism has technically gotten higher for the first time, I think,
mm-hmm.
if it makes sense, in the history of this trend, because now essentially you kind of might have to have your uh, for lack of a better term, shit together in terms of
Yeah.
your earnings, so that you
Mm-hmm,
can actually afford to basically speak with potentially a legal representative from either your country or the country you're trying to get into, so that you in some ways can actually buy your way into the country, and that's only going to be available to you if you're actually making, a decent earning. But the interesting thing about digital nomadism is it's always had this wide range of people who are,
mm-hmm.
at the beginning, maybe they're just starting out, they're trying to go to Thailand, which is a very low cost of living country for a lot of people, where they can survive on, maybe less $500, $1,000 a month, and they just have their laptop, and they're dabbling, right? They have that
Mm-hmm.
chance to kind of see what's going to stick. How will they earn their income? But that's not really as possible anymore. And so perhaps what this means is people are going to have to get a lot more consistent with their remote earning in their home country before they can travel, if things stay the way they are now. So that's the
Yeah,
short term. So this is why I wanted to bring up the long term with you, though. So
yeah,
now
yeah.
the interesting thing I saw in the news recently was that, for example, UK has just approved first one of the first countries to approve a COVID vaccine,
Mm-hmm.
and there might be again, right, a very rapid changing of all these rules as a vaccine that hopefully works becomes available around the world. So, what do you think on that topic?
Mm-hmm.
With vaccines that potentially work becoming available, do you think that the rules will kind of revert a bit once some stability comes, and perhaps as a result of that? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it may vary by country because, as you mentioned, Thailand, even before COVID-19, Thailand was becoming less friendly to so-called backpackers, right?
Okay.
They were pushing this VIP visa, and for one of the few countries in the emerging developing world that was like turning away Americans or people with so-called first world passports on the grounds that, hey, you just did a visa run and you're back in, so play by the rules kind of thing. So I think it's not going to go back in terms of enforcement of existing rules. And I think the rules are going to get stricter. And once a jurisdiction gets a taste for greater control of its borders, they're not going to backpedal on that. And that leads me to
Yeah.
another trend which we're seeing, which is nationalism. So obviously we know of the trade conflict between certain powers, superpowers, but it's manifesting in other countries as well. Other countries are electing democratically leaders who have uh, a mandate to put their country first, right? And I'm not just talking about
Okay.
the U.S. or the U.K. with Brexit, or the Philippines with the territory, or Australia, or whatever. It's across the
Yeah.
world. Especially when there's an economic contraction, nationalism is on the rise, and that nationalism was on the rise even when there was economic growth. So it's going to be exacerbated. So in terms of the vaccine, circling back to your question, I don't think so. I don't think so. There would be some relaxation in some jurisdictions, but for the most part, the countries that were progressively getting more difficult to enter will continue to do so. So the US has always been, unless you come from another wealthy country, of course, and you have that passport, the US will continue to be a challenge to get in, as would the other Anglo-Saxon countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK. And to a large extent, Fortress Europe will continue to protect its borders. And yeah, so I don't, the bottom line is no, I don't see a reversal in that. It will continue to be difficult to get in.
Okay. Now, what I heard you saying though is that kind of potentially more so applies to some of these, I think, economic superpowers. Now, on the flip side, do you think then there's potentially an opportunity for some countries that potentially are not known now as big tourist destinations to kind of make their way into becoming tourist destinations by having extremely lax kind of visa rules or visiting rules compared to these other countries we're talking about?
One would have thought so if one was being completely logical, but then what we're seeing,
which I thought I was smart, so
which is what, but we're seeing the complete opposite. You see Thailand, which is probably
really?
one of the biggest destinations from a tourist perspective.
Sorry, which country?
Thailand.
Okay,
And
yeah.
you had like Phuket, the governor was begging practically to let people back in, and Bangkok basically said no. Same with Boracay against Manila. Same with Bali against Jakarta. So the governor of Jakarta, he was predicting is going to open months ago, and then basically Jakarta is saying no. You will experience economic collapse, but we want to protect our borders. So if they are doing it right now and they are watching parts of the economy implode, basically, I don't see them being motivated to reverse it completely. Again, yes, they will allow tourists back in, but the barrier to entry will be high. They will be looking for people who probably, as you said, they have their shit together. They can prove that they can economically sustain themselves. If they're staying long term, they will probably trigger tax residence, and that needs to be considered. They'll need to pay some taxes. They'll for those flying into Phuket right now, the government is going to mandate which hotels you can stay in. So the point is that I think nationalism is here to stay and is not going to reverse even in the developing world.
Dang.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of what we're hearing, but you got to deal with the facts as they are. So, okay, with all of this in mind then, for someone who's watching, who's an aspiring digital nomad, what would be your big tip to them in terms of what should you be focusing on preparing if you're still kind of gung-ho about being able to live your digital nomad dream and travel and work remotely? What are they going to have to really focus on doing differently now than maybe even 2 years ago?
I think, just to repeat what the message that you've said here and that you say in the group, which is you need to get a plan. So, forget all those guys on YouTube who are selling fantasies. You have a Lamborghini,
but how can we forget
a swimming
them?
pool.
They're marketing ads follow us everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be real about what works and what doesn't work, and you need to have a sustainable source of income before you enter the country. They will cut down on people who are just doing visa runs or people who are spending an extended period of time on triggering tax residency, and they want to see what you're earning potentially, and you need to deal with that. So you need to have a plan. You need to have a plan. And in terms of moving around, from both a tax and an immigration perspective, as we've kind of hinted previously, there are a lot of cowboys. These are obviously people who, I mean, they maybe were very well intentioned or not. I mean, everybody's different, but they give unqualified advice, and sometimes people get in trouble. So, you'd want to be, given that nationalism is real, then you would want to be seen as always following the rules. So I know people talk about hacks and shortcuts. If you do this, if you lie about this, no one's going to figure it out. I think one needs to be more careful with that.
Okay.
The chances of getting caught, the countries are more sensitive to it. So make sure you follow the rules from an immigration perspective. And
Absolutely.
if you're working internationally, make sure you're following the rules from a tax perspective because you don't want to get caught out with either.
Okay. Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the other question that I have
Mm-hmm.
in mind is this so is the history of digital nomadism, it started to exist as soon as basically technically as early as phones became available, but really
Mm-hmm.
as kind of laptops and Wi-Fi kind of became more universal. This is when digital nomadism has started to really boom. This is technically one, to my knowledge, anyways, one of the only I think recessions in the trend of digital nomadism in terms of at least traveling. Remote work, that's another topic. That's absolutely booming. But digital nomadism, which is actually remotely working and traveling, this is one of the first times so far in this trend
Mm-hmm.
of itself where it's kind of had a recession
Mm.
in terms of its popularity. Would you agree?
I think it's evolving. Before, the perception, rightly or wrongly, of a digital nomad is some guy, eating pot noodles and counting pennies and backpacking and doing just enough to pay the next night at the hostel. That is
Yeah,
what people had in their minds, and that's why some countries were pushing back on it. But
yeah,
I think it's evolving. Now you're seeing remote work or work from home is now part of the new normal. And that is
yeah,
not just at lower levels, but mid management, executive board level. You can be anywhere with consequences, but you can be anywhere. So I think it's just evolving. It's just evolving.
yeah,
And with that comes an opportunity. But of course, the days, as with any other trend that you would have imagined, from filmmaking to the technology, at first it's like the Wild West, and then norms,
yeah,
rules, and regulations and structures begin to form. And then it
yeah.
becomes part of the status quo. And in
Okay,
my mind, that's what's happening with nomad work as well.
okay. And
Mm.
I like the word you mentioned, which is evolution, because what's
Uh,
coming to mind right now is that actually, in some ways, digital nomadism isn't necessarily fully going through a recession, but it is going to
mm,
pivot in one way, I think, in the short term for sure, which is that people are going to start to actually explore their own countries
mhm,
a lot more because that's what's going to be available to them. Because
mhm,
as we just both have agreed, remote work is absolutely becoming much more popular. It's much more normalized. And as more people have the flexibility that comes with remote work and still have flexibility to travel within their own country, that's still going to be new to them, right? And so
mhm,
it'll be interesting to see how much more kind of moving around people are doing within their own countries. And I think like me and you have definitely seen in our travels, we've got kind of supportive infrastructure for these things in certain countries, like co-working spaces or co-living spaces, and these kind of things. And perhaps we'll start to. I think we're definitely going to start to see more of those in countries where they don't even exist right now, barely, like
mhm,
Canada
mhm.
and the U.S. These things are well, co-working is kind of there, but co-living is not a thing, and we'll see how it changes. Okay, so I think we just kind of touched on some of the major, I think your major trend you observed from the interviews you did, but what about some outliers? Was just some odd, any kind of odd learn, like, come on, 100 people, there's got to be something, some interesting, weird things you learned.
uh, let's see. I think the idea of a city again is being
Ah,
fundamentally
okay,
challenged, right? So
cool. Yeah,
if it
tell me.
is if it is you were working in technology, in software, you want to be as close to the Bay Area as possible. If you're in hardware, you want it to be in Shenzhen. In financial services, New York or London. With these guys or these industries embracing remote work, geographical proximity probably is no longer as critical as it once was. And
Yeah,
therefore, there's a lot of hype in the media about people leaving LA to, let's say, go to Texas or New York to Florida. So there is a movement away from certain urban areas, and as to even out of London, you know, to outside, and people are saying the city of London, the square mile is pretty empty. As to whether they return, do they really need to? Now businesses realize, you know what, I could save a whole lot of money in terms of office rent. And for the
Yeah.
most part, I'm adapting my management style so I can manage teams of remote workers. So I think I don't know what the outcome would be, but the way in which we conceptualize the city is going to change. Now that leads to a critical question. Like, one of the great things is about being in a certain ecosystem is the networking effect. You know, the
Yeah.
connections, those accidental connections, like how you and I met in Bali, or whatever the case may be. How do you meet these people and make meaningful business and personal connections as well? And I think that's where the way social media is presently constructed may evolve. Because right now, social media, in a way, is I kind of met you, I kind of know who you are because you know, like we kind of knew each other from wherever. And so let's stay in touch. It's a way of like, let's keep in touch on Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram or whatever. I met you. Hey, what's your Instagram handle? Let's keep in touch. Now, I think that's how you would meet someone. You would meet them first on social media, as to whether or not you meet them physically because of the various restrictions,
Okay.
at least in the foreseeable future. I don't know. So I think the the ecosystems, or the clusters that were around certain industries, it would evolve to more virtual as opposed to physical, which presents itself as a challenge. And again, this is an acceleration of pre-existing trends, because some people would argue that, for example, Hong Kong, even before the protests and whatever, and to some extent Singapore, people were beginning to embrace technology, and now more so. You can do a Zoom meeting. Do I really need to fly to Singapore for a meeting? We could do Zoom. Let's keep in touch that way. So I think the urban lifestyle is going to change, and you see it
Yeah.
in different ways, not just work, but in terms of retail. You know, shopping malls in some countries, or the high street in the UK is being challenged as well. Why are we going to shop
Okay.
online? You know, so
Yeah.
the way we interact in terms of working together, in terms of socializing and shopping, it's already going digital, but it will have an impact on the way cities are structured and our lifestyle. So
Yeah. No, it makes sense. It's very interesting to think about that. Like the example of San Francisco, for example. Yes,
mhm,
it's absolutely one of the largest kind of tech hubs in the world for talented, digital people.
mhm,
But why, right? I don't know. I've been to San Francisco. Geographically, I don't know. Yes, they have fast Wi-Fi, but everywhere's got fast. There's many other places
uh,
with really fast Wi-Fi. So geographically,
uh,
there's nothing actually I think that unique about it that's pulling the talent there. It's just kind of that's where the momentum kicked off and it's grown and that's the hub. But that's going to shift. So then
mhm,
when people are no longer, at least digital people, because the reality is the world we live in is still a lot of non-digital work, and that's not going to
mhm,
exactly disappear overnight. But more and more people are going online or remote,
mhm,
and so I don't know. Are we going to see more people start to live in the cities based on interest rather than work?
mhm,
That's going to be my hope. That's going to be my
mhm,
hope because that's what for me part of what digital nomadism is all about. Is great. You have interest beyond how you earn your income. I hope so. You're a human being.
mhm.
Uh,
Yeah,
go
yeah,
go explore those. Right. Go. That's the
yeah,
best part. Is if you
mhm,
like mountain biking like I do,
mhm,
then go
yeah,
live in a mountain town. Or
yeah,
if you're into poetry, then maybe you stick in San Francisco, an urban center where there's that vibrant kind of population that has a lot of that kind of creativity.
mhm.
Do you think there will be more focus of people moving to where their personal interests lie, or is this just wishful thinking and we have to see what happens? What do you think on that?
I would agree with you, but then I also agree with the point that you made. You just touched on it, but I'd want to shine a light on it, which
All
is
right.
this: not everyone has the opportunity to work remotely, right? So these are
Yes.
disproportionately relatively higher income earners, right? It's not the, someone who does physical work. It's not a waitress. It's not, regular people. So for those who can afford it, and because remember we saying that one of the trends is social inequality. So for those who are on the right side of that wall or that fence, yeah, that comes with opportunity, that comes with privilege. And yes, you can join communities because you can work anywhere. You no longer need to stay in the city in New York or whatever. So you can, if you like surfing, yeah, go somewhere, Hawaii or whatever, you can work remotely. So I think it does present opportunities for quality of life, but again, it will be skewed to a certain demographic.
Absolutely, it will be skewed. I will play devil's advocate a little bit here.
Yeah.
So you said, not everyone can get into working remotely, but, and I agree with that at a level, because ultimately, at a minimum, what you would need to get into remote work in some capacity is basically a cell phone and internet connection. And the fact is that in countries around the world have unequal access to those things. Countries like US and Canada, almost everyone has a cell phone, and there's free Wi-Fi and fast Wi-Fi and all these things. In other countries, that's just not the case. So of course that's still happening, but I think I hear all the time from living in Canada and exploring in the US, still there's this attitude, oh yeah, I can't get into remote work. I'm stuck at my crappy job at the gas station. And the reality is they work at the gas station for, 8 hours a day. They have their cell phone, they have a laptop even. They get home and then they watch 2 hours of Netflix in 4K, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the opportunity is actually there, there some things like tax advice we don't want to lean too heavily on from others, but when it comes to getting into remote work and developing skills, the world of YouTube and other resources, at least in my personal experience, has been massive. I learned more outside of a formal college education in the world of digital marketing, much more actually through free publications, blogs, and YouTube videos, and free resources online. And that is, I still think, the case for the majority of remote work styles. There are still exceptions, especially I think accounting, law, some of these very traditional niches. They're still very much rooted. That's not the case, but mostly everything else is really becoming a world of, I don't care where you went to school, can you do the job well? And I love that personally. So
I 100% agree with that. That the formal education system, to a large extent, has failed many of us, and major mainstream companies. I'm talking like Google or like even bigger four accounting firms like Ernst and Young. Some of the big companies are recognizing, you know what? I'm not going to judge someone by their formal qualifications. Can you do the job? That's it. I agree with you.
Yeah, and I love that. It's anyways. Okay. Any other key insights that came up in your interviews, Darren?
Let's see. I mean lots, but if I circle back to tax, right? I think when people have the discussion around how they handle their finances, they think about what does the jurisdiction demand, but they don't think about banking. I think the biggest leaps in terms of regulation that we've seen recently, and that will only increase, is around banking rules. So it's becoming more and more difficult to open a bank account in the first place. And when you move funds around, it's coming under more scrutiny. So what we've seen, and this is pre-COVID-19, we've seen that when some people, they've been traveling for a while and it's time to move back into, for the want of a better word, like a first world country, and they may have an account in an emerging market, and they want to make a transfer and they find out that they cannot. Why? Because that first world bank is going to want to know, where did this money come from? And you could say, well, I was a remote worker, here's my website, here are my invoices or whatever. And they say, well, that's all well and good, but give anybody 5 minutes in Microsoft Excel and they can produce invoices, right? So how do we know that this money is legit? You need to
Yeah.
prove to us that this money is clean, and it's a source of funds report. And the most convincing way is with a tax return, a government document that says that this money has been declared in whatever country it is, and it's fine. Because if you look at what's been happening recently, most of the major banks have been subject to fines and to lots of legal action for breaking certain rules, and they want to err on the side of caution. And if they don't understand what you do, the default position is no. We don't want your money. We don't want you as a customer. So we've had many clients who they were born and raised in a European country, in the UK and Canada, Australia, whatever, and they've been traveling around for a while. Okay, it's time to go back home. Maybe I want to buy a home, I want to buy a car, I want to take care of family, whatever. And they realize that their money's locked out of their home because because of the banking rules being as strict as they are, and which could have been alleviated had they been mindful of taxes. So I think the banking rules is something for everyone to keep their eyes on, especially those who do business internationally.
So, because this actually topic is not something I've learned too much on personally. So, are you saying basically that kind of your local bank account in your home country, they will actually kind of decline like an incoming wire from a foreign currency?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Especially if it comes from certain countries. I mean, I don't mean to stereotype or to judge, but imagine being in a US bank, like you have an account with Wells Fargo or Chase or whatever, and then you've been living in Colombia for a while and you're returning back to the US and you're going to transfer 20, 30,000 US dollars from Colombia.
Okay.
People have things in their mind, and obviously it's completely
They've been
wrong. They watch
watching Narcos.
too much Netflix, but
Yeah.
the burden of proof is high. The burden of proof is pretty high. So while you enjoy the benefit and the privilege that comes with earning hard currency while living in a developing country, if at any point in time you have an intention to return or to repatriate those funds, be prepared to explain. Banks, they want to see invoices.
Right.
Okay, who's your customer? They want to contact that customer to make sure that they did pay
Wow.
you. So it is what it is. It's something to be conscious of.
That's interesting. This is not a
Mm-hmm.
topic I've heard so far. So I think that, for me personally, that's going to be my biggest takeaway of our
Yeah.
conversation today. But yeah, we covered a lot of interesting things. I think we'll wrap things up now, Darren. But if
Mm-hmm.
people have questions about kind of international tax law for remote
Mm-hmm.
working and digital nomadism, and they want an expert's help like yourself, where can they get in touch with you if they want some help?
HTJ.tax. Just go to HTJ.tax
Okay.
and contact details there. I get a lot of messages on Facebook, but what Facebook does is, they throw it in spam. So I don't see it
Okay.
until like
Yeah.
months after. I apologize for people who have been messaging me, but
Yeah.
the spam filter is pretty aggressive on Facebook. So HTJ.tax,
Especially
and you'll
about money
see
stuff, probably too, right?
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the best way website.
All right.
Yeah.
HTJ.tax. Awesome.
Correct. Yeah.
Darren, absolute pleasure. Thanks for joining us at the Digital
Likewise.
Nomads Forum. And I'm sure we'll have you back in the next little while.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Have a good day, evening, wherever you are.
Okay. Bye, Darren.
Bye bye.